Welcome to the Vintage Vibe.
So I don't know if you can relate, but if you've ever been out and you track down a piece of vintage audio gear and you load it up in your car, whether it's a receiver or it's a pair of speakers. Now it's usually the speakers that you'll find this with. And as you're driving home, you find yourself rolling down the windows quickly in the vehicle because it just stinks. And this was the exact case with these Technics 7000s. They smelled like a cross between mothballs, nicotine, and cabbage. Ugh. So I'll give you a couple tips that might help you if you find yourself in the exact same situation as I was. So here are those behemoths from 1975, the Technics 7000s. Probably about 80 pounds, so keep that in mind if you're trying to jam these in the back of your Honda Civic. They are big, they're very imposing, and they're heavy. Now moving around to the front of them here, you can see I've got the grills removed. I've got the top hat still on them, which we'll take off in a second. The first thing I did when I got these home was I took some compressed air and I blew the cabinets down, getting into all the nooks and the crannies, blow down all the grills, blow the top hats down. Again, I don't want to bring any travelers home. And that's kind of a place to start, just to dust these things down. If you're going to do it, be very careful when you get to the components if you're going to blow them down with compressed air, particularly the woofers or the tweeters. The tweeters are almost impossible to find replacements in the woofers, being 13 some odd inches. Although these surrounds are quite durable, they're a rubberized foam, which is probably why they've lasted as long as they have. If you do hit them with 50, 60, 70 psi of air and you make a hole in them, I doubt you'll ever find a replacement for them. So my opinion is really use a light bristle painter's brush if you want to kind of dust the actual drivers off. Again, being very careful around those surrounds. You can see right above the frames of the speakers, this is where there used to be foam. It was a foam gasket, and I hope, or I would suspect, that most of that foam still retains underneath of the edges of the speaker, but it's not unusual for that foam to deteriorate. That you can see here. Very common with this speaker. Something that is also very common, when you take the top hat off, you're going to notice here glue right underneath of the mid-range driver on the cabinet. Technics had placed here a piece of foam. It was a pad, and again, it was underneath the mid-range driver and the tweeter to prevent the reflection of sound. Technics in the linear phase design was being very particular about the timing of how the high frequencies, the mid-range, and the bass frequencies would reach your ear. Now, I tried to remove that glue with some Goo Gone. I couldn't get it off. It's really hard to remove this stuff. And again, after 3 pairs of Technics 7000s and having the same problem, what I typically do is I cut a piece of foam to the exact size of the original and I'll reapply it there. You'll never know, that it wasn't original. Now I've gone ahead and removed the top hat on the second speaker just to show you the same problem here with the foam underneath the mid-range. But I want to zoom in on something because I see a lot of 7000s over the years. Again, now they're becoming harder and harder to find, but you can see this mid-range driver looks different than the other one did. If you were looking, the cone is actually a brown kind of shade. And what it is there's a coating on it, and about 60% of it's been wiped off. And I'm guessing that when they wiped it off on this one, trying to clean the actual speaker, they decide not to do it to the second one. I'm going to guess it's there for reasons of dampening. I'm not 100% sure, but again, something to keep your eye out if you are looking to buy a pair of these. So these cabinets required a lot of cleaning. I had to use a citrus wipe to help break down some of the grime and the nicotine, and then switch to a soft bristle brush with some warm water and soap detergent to try to get actually into the dimpling on the finish of this plastic veneer. If you look close on an angle, you'll see there's little divots in this veneer, and that's where, the grime, the nicotine was kind of hiding. So wiping it down time after time again, the water just kind of kept on turning yellow until I finally gave it a good scrubbing with that brush. The last thing you've got to kind of pay some attention to is the grills. Again, there's a lot of real estate here with the top half, or the top hat as I call it, and then the bottom section of the grill. And if there's any odors, or if someone was a smoker, which they were in this case, it's going to stick to the fabric. And there are a couple tips to try to remove that odor from the fabric. And no, I'm not just talking about using Febreze. So my suggestion for the grills: mix up a light solution or a mild solution of vinegar and water in a spray bottle, lightly mist the grills, and then once they're slightly saturated, again, don't oversaturate because the frames of these grills are made out of wood, and you will warp the wood as it starts to dry if you over soak them. Take a paper towel and blot the grills from the front side and the back side, and you'll literally see the dirt kind of be lifted right out. The vinegar smell will soon dissipate, and then you can hit them with some Febreze once they've all dried out. And one of my favorite things to do once I spend all that time to give them a cleaning is just to sit down and listen to my labor of love. Ah, the sweet sound of Technics. I really admire Technics for a few different reasons. They not only spoke to the consumer mass market, but they also spoke to the more particular audiophile. They made some fantastic products over the years, as well as some, consumer grade stuff. Let's take a peek at these 7000s, talk a little bit about their history, the design, how they sound, and whether or not they deserve a place in your vintage audio collection. So what is linear phase, and why the heck did Technics do it? Well, Technics realized that there is a common problem with two-way speakers and three-way speakers. In fact, any speaker system that uses multiple drivers, the sound energy may not reach your ear at the exact same time, and it will affect the accuracy of the speaker. So Technics mounted the bass driver up front, the mid-range driver slightly recessed behind in its own unique cabinet, and the tweeter even further back on top. Again, this mid-range cabinet does not share any space with the bass cabinet below. All that's in there is some acoustic insulation, as well as a fairly complex crossover network. I'll show you that shortly. And the actual tweeter up top, this is all magnet, so there's quite a large magnet on it. And you notice there's actually a little sticker on it that warns you to keep watches and magnetic tape away because you may damage them. It is a pretty powerful magnet. I had a screwdriver up top when I was servicing the backs of these speakers, as well as some screws, and they were literally pulled 6 inches across the cabinet right to the magnet. So keep that in mind if you do happen to place anything on the top of these speakers. So we opened up the back of the cabinets to take a peek at the crossovers. They're quite elaborate, lots of capacitors in there and coils. It was a good thing we checked, because you can see here we almost experienced a short. They had tried to repair this with masking tape. Never a good thing. So not only was Technics paying attention to the timing of the speaker, trying to build a better sounding speaker, but they also paid attention to design. I mean, this is a very unique looking speaker. You've got handles on the sides, which are quite functional. I do use them to lift the speakers up. And then you have these rods on either side flanking the woofer. They look like they're part of the structure, but I think the only purpose they actually provide is to hold the front speaker grills in place. The speaker grills themselves, you may be able to see here, have got rubber grommets on the sides of them, and they actually lock into place on this metal rod. Really, really cool looking. And in typical 1970s fashion, we started to see this in the Technics products, this little graph kind of across the top, and it really doesn't serve much of a purpose except to try to, make you believe that it is a relatively flat sounding speaker. And that's kind of what they're depicting here in the graph, is the response of the speaker. Nonetheless, kind of cool. Another neat thing here when you look up top is the speaker wire terminals. They're very odd. You actually have to unscrew
this terminal, slide the wire into it, the bare wire, and then lock it in place. I've seen some people change this over to banana plugs, which is probably a good idea, so that you can get a heavier gauge wire in there. Right now I think I have an 18 gauge in there, or a 16 gauge at best. They are 150 watts peak power handling on them, so they will handle a fair amount of power. And you can see here you've also got a couple controls for both the high frequency as well as the mid frequency to give it a little bit of a boost in the crossover. Now, as it would go, these speakers are fairly power hungry. They are a 6 ohm speaker, and they will benefit from an amplifier that's got some current. I found that the volume setting on my amplifier was almost twice as high as what I normally would use it at with the Allison ones behind the Technics. So they will benefit again from an amplifier that can deliver the current without a doubt. I want to show you one last really cool thing. I originally thought these were acoustic suspension speakers, but as you drift down below the woofer, now if you can see here, this very thin kind of groove right across the cabinet, that is actually the port. Yes, believe it or not, that is the port. If you put your hand in front of that when the speaker's playing, you'll feel air moving out of it. Really, really cool. Kind of reminds me of a transmission line. So how do they sound? They're a pretty unique sounding speaker, and if you think about their time, 1975, relatively mass market producer of speakers and gear Techniques. Given all that, putting that all in perspective, and the fact that they were trying something new with the linear phase design, they're pretty decent sounding. So the bottom end on the speakers is pretty accurate. There's a good punch to them, and they play quite low, which is something that's great in particular if you don't necessarily always want to listen to your music loud. They're definitely a full-bodied speaker. They're a little thicker in the mid-range. When I toggle back and forth between these and the Allison ones, that's very pronounced, the mid-range. The high frequency, surprisingly enough, is not as pronounced as I thought it would be with that top-mounted tweeter, but it's quite natural sounding. They're just a very smooth kind of analog sounding speaker. They're not extremely dynamic. You do have to turn them up to get them moving, but you really can't fault them if you just want a relaxing, easygoing speaker. So they don't do one thing particularly kind of exceptional, but they do a bunch of things relatively well. And if the test is just sitting back and being able to listen to them for a long period of time, you'll find yourself doing that quite easily. So how much will you pay for a pair of these? Anywhere between 500 Canadian to as high as about $800 in 2020. The funny thing is, about 7 years ago when I bought my last pair of 7000s, I paid the same amount for them then as I did today. They never seem to be difficult to find a new home for them. Technics collectors really seem to be attracted to these speakers for a whole bunch of reasons, as we've already discussed here today. So if you do try them, you won't have any problem moving them on to the next owner if you decide to do that. So the very last thing we got to do is rate them. Are they something that you ought to put in your vintage audio collection? Well, if you're a Technics fan, I definitely think there's something you should try. Again, they don't really do any wrong. You won't have any problems if you do decide to sell them. And they're fairly obtainable in terms of dollars and cents. They're just getting a little harder to find nowadays. So yes, I give it a yay for your vintage audio collection. Thanks for joining us on The Vintage Vibe. Don't forget to like and subscribe.